Believe me, I would love for there to be an argument on best conference in college football. It would be a great discussion to have, but it's not a discussion. The SEC is the best conference by any measurement on the field and otherwise. But how dominant is the SEC? Well, let's go back to the run of 7 BCS championship games and wins in a row by the SEC from 2006 through 2012. At that point, there, like now, was really no question that the SEC was king. Now, before that, certainly the Big 12 had its run, the Big 10 as well, and the SEC was right there in the mix. And there was a great debate before the SEC took control with Florida obliterating Ohio State in 2006, and the run continued from there. But let's keep in mind that the SEC was always selected to go to the BCS championship game. Let's also keep in mind that the winner of a conference, wink, wink, Florida State in 2013, Clemson in 2018, doesn't just determine the fate of the conference or the standing of the conference. We are looking at conferences from 1 through 10, 12, or 14, depending on your conference, to decide which is the best conference. But certainly that was one standard. The national groupthink at that point was that the SEC was the best merely based on that national championship run. The deeper dive that I took at the time, and certainly we will discuss here as we move along with a lot of these analysis videos, is that the SEC was king, but the gap was a lot smaller than people would have you believe. And that's why you lock it in here, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, because we take the deep dive for the smart fan, you who loves college football. All right, we're talking right now, though. Who is the best? Well, it's the SEC. So we're going to look at 3 different measurements. The players coming into school, then 3 to 4 years later, the players leaving school and those indicators, and then most importantly, what happens on the field. That's what matters, because you can have the best players or near the best players, and they don't get developed, and then you always need talent, but you can take a little bit lesser talent, i.e. Wisconsin, Stanford in the past, and develop them into top 5 or 10 teams. But the SEC has the dominance on the field in terms of the player talent, and the coaching has been raised recently in the conference as well after a bit of a swoon in quarterback play. Let's look at the dominance. Well, the NFL draft was just a few weeks ago, and the SEC took top honors for a 14th consecutive year in dominating the NFL draft. Final totals: SEC 64, Big 10 48, Pac-12 32, ACC 27, and the Big 12 had 21. The American Conference actually had 17 players drafted. Of course, most players in the first round make NFL rosters, and then the rate of great players, impact players, starters, and even role players who make a roster deteriorates and decreases as you go through the NFL draft. Of course, even though it's not an exact science, the player personnel directors know enough to draft the potentially great players in the first round, and then on and on and on. There's less rosters made as you make your way through the NFL draft. So just to look at the sheer numbers, yes, the SEC had the best numbers, but if you look at the premier players that were drafted in the first 2 rounds of the draft, that's where the SEC really proves its distance from the field. In the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft, make that the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft, the SEC had 40 players taken, 15 in the first round out of 32 selections. So the entire country, including the other 4 Power 5 conferences, had 17 players drafted, and the SEC 15 in the first round. So again, for the first 3 rounds, the SEC came in at 40, the Big 10 17, the Pac-12 12, the Big 12 10, and the ACC down at 8. Generally, I don't have the numbers to back this up, but generally in my recollection of collecting these numbers just about every year, and once we have the big Mark Rogers TV voice of college football staff, we will certainly track these numbers and keep the big database year to year, but I'm a man of one, staff of one. So I don't have my notes from previous years, but that 40-17 gap between the SEC and the Big Ten is typically more like 35-25. So this is a stark number right there for the other four Power 5 conferences, 40-17 over the Big Ten, 12, 10, and 8. All right. On NFL rosters, going into the 2019 season, the SEC comprised 339 spots on NFL rosters. The Big Ten, 253. So nearly 100 more players from the SEC than the Big Ten. Let me do the math. 86 more from the SEC than the Big Ten, the two power brokers in the sport. The ACC at 215, the Pac-12 next, and then the Big 12. And then check out the numbers in the parentheses because they actually tell us more because, of course, we don't have the same number of teams in each conference with the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 10 with 14 teams, the Big 12 with 10, the Pac-12 has 12. Therefore, you see the disparity where the Pac-12, despite having less overall players on 2019 NFL rosters, actually had more players per team than the ACC at 15.8 compared to 15.4. But the SEC, again, with a big margin over the Big Ten at 24 per team versus 18 for the Big Dime. All right, what about the production on the field? That's the roster makeup of the players drafted, their potential with the first three rounds, and then, of course, making the rosters. But how do they produce? Well, I'm not going to go through every position on the field, but just to give you an indication, let's look at the guys that carry the football, throw the football, and catch the football. 9 of the top 40 rushers in the National Football League in 2019 hailed from the SEC. 9 of the top 40 rushers, 9 of the top 40 pass receivers as well. And then you had 5 starting quarterbacks from the SEC. Dak Prescott, Mississippi State with the Dallas Cowboys, looking for a new contract. Ryan Tannehill, who made it to the AFC Championship game with the Tennessee Titans, hailing from Texas A&M. Actually, he did not play in the SEC, so that's another whole breakdown that we could do in regards to the actual players and where they played when that school was in a different conference. For Ryan Tannehill, Texas A&M, of course, since 2012 in the SEC Western Division, but he played in the Big 12. We will credit the SEC with the starting quarterback of Ryan Tannehill. Also, Cincinnati's expected starter for 2020 is Joe Burrow. We've got Drew Lock from Denver, and we also have Matthew Stafford, who hailed from Georgia, and now with the Detroit Lions, of course. Eli Manning lost his starting job to Daniel Jones, but longtime starter with the New York Giants, now retired. And you also have, of course, Cam Newton, longtime starter with the Carolina Panthers of Auburn, and he's looking for a new job. All right, the ACC, this is our maybe first and only stat that will favor any other conference. The ACC had 9 starting quarterbacks in the NFL in 2019. The Big Ten with 5, the Pac-12 with the Big 12 with 5, and the Pac-12 with just 2. One of those being Aaron Rodgers, one of the greatest of all time. So that's the NFL draft. That is both showing the production of those players in college, but also their talent projection toward the NFL. So really talented players from the SEC, of course, are going to be evaluated that way to be projected to be NFL players. In recruiting, so this goes hand in hand. Again, there are misses, there are booms and busts, both in recruiting from high school into the college ranks, and then your booms and busts, the great players from the collegiate ranks who are busts in the NFL, and then guys that were decent players at the collegiate level who break out and become big-time players in the NFL. But generally, we're looking at mass numbers, volumes of players. The recruiting rankings do not lie, and the NFL draft selections do not lie. For the SEC in 2020, 3 of the top 4 classes in the country hailed from the SEC, 6 of the top 8, 7 of the top 9, 8 of the top 18 in the country from the SEC. Similar figures going back to the beginning of recruiting rankings, period. In 2019, it was 4 of the top 5 for the SEC, and almost the entire conference made its way into the top 25 in 2019. 2018, 7 of the top 18. You see similar numbers in 2017 and also 2016, when half or at least half of the top 10 to 15 classes in the nation in recruiting hailed from the SEC. In regards to player rankings, I think the disparity here is even more gaping. In 2020, 15 of the top 25 players, think about that. None of the top 25 players in the nation, generally outside of an Ed Oliver, which is an aberration going to Houston, will play outside the Power 5. So in 2020, 15 of the top 25 players in the nation signed with SEC schools, and 51 of the top 100. So they account for at least half of the elite players in the nation, and the other 4 conferences get the other half. In 2019, it was 18 of the top 29 and 50 of the top 100. Actually, in 2018, the SEC did not do quite as well with 29 of the top 100, but again, the other 4 major conferences would share the other 71 at top players, with the Big Ten with 19. So that's the closest gap we've seen, certainly in the last 3 years, with the Big Ten with 19 and the ACC with 18 of the top 100, trailing the SEC's 29 in 2018. All right. Those are all about rankings. And again, the play on the field verifies and confirms and validates the rankings, but they still are just rankings. What about the results on the field? In 2019, the SEC went 16-8 against the Power 5. The Big Ten, the Big 12, and the Pac-12 all went around 500. And the ACC against the Power 5, 6-19. Now, every conference had its embarrassing losses, but the SEC's were certainly minimal and were not against the Power 5. You had your Tennessee loss to Georgia State in particular, and Arkansas has been losing to just about everyone for the past 3 or 4 years. The wins for this conference against quality competition blows everybody else away. The SEC in 2019 defeated Clemson, Oklahoma, Oregon, Notre Dame, Michigan, Virginia, Louisville, Indiana, Virginia Tech, Miami, and Florida State. I know some people are going to jump on me and say Miami and Florida State were not good teams. No, they weren't, but I threw them in as bowl teams with talent. All right. They really had no bad Power 5 losses. They really didn't outside the conference. Look across the board. I'm not finding the bad Power 5 losses. LSU beat everyone. Alabama beat everyone outside of the conference. Auburn lost to Minnesota, but Minnesota finished in the top 10. Tennessee won its bowl game. They lost to BYU. Okay. If you consider BYU a Power 5 team. And there's really nothing else to go on. That was a bad loss for the conference. Ole Miss was a 5-win football team. They lost to a Cal team that won 8 games with a play at the goal line by that much. The SEC just didn't have bad Power 5 losses. Everybody else had multiple bad losses. Again, probably the worst one, Auburn, as a 7-point favorite, losing to a Minnesota team that finished 11-2 in the top 10 in the nation. That's not a bad loss. Can't say that about any other conference. All right. What it all means is that the reality is that in terms of the resources and factors that determine the results on the field, money, resources, facilities, rear ends in the seats, TV dollars that come from TV ratings, the SEC and the Big Ten own the sport. But once you take all those resources and then combine it with the talent in the South that is owned by Florida and Texas as 2 of the top 3 recruiting states, California being the other one, And then the great talent base in Georgia, specifically the Atlanta metro area, which produces more NFL players than any metro area in the country. Louisiana per capita produces more NFL players than anywhere in the nation. The SEC turns into elite above anybody else. If we look at the elite tier of college football right now, it's Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State. Definitely those three. If LSU continues to do what they do in winning a national championship, of course, they were elite for the 1 year in 2019. But right now it's Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, Clemson. We can put Georgia, they're kind of a difficult argument there. They could be in the first tier. They could be in the second tier. But also in the second tier for the SEC, this is where it, again, there's a differentiation because Florida, Auburn are second-tier type teams. You do have Penn State and Michigan in the Big Ten, possibly Wisconsin. You potentially would have Texas, but they certainly haven't played like a second-tier team, aside from winning the Sugar Bowl 2 years ago and going to the Big 12 championship game for the past 10 years. Texas has not been an elite team or even second-tier team. Oregon looks like they're playing the part right now in the Pac-12. And again, the ACC has nobody past Clemson. It's Clemson, and then you drop to a top 35 to 40 team in the nation like Virginia, Louisville, Miami, whomever. That's what it comes down to. The SEC recruits the best players because they've got the best players in their backyard. They make the most money. They put the most people in the seats. They have the best TV ratings, again, as challenged by the Big Ten. And then it's no surprise that they win the most on the field, especially in the big games against the top opponents from the other conferences. And then those players, having been recruited and evaluated to be the best out of high school and performing the best on the field in college, then move on to the NFL in greater quantities and at the top of the NFL draft, evidenced by 15 of 32 first-round selections in 2020. My thoughts on the SEC versus the nation and their dominance in college football, probably more so right now than what we've seen going back to about 2012, 2011, when the Big Ten started to emerge and challenge the SEC. The ACC had a big 2016 in which Clemson, of course, won the national championship and Florida State was solid, and the conference went 10-3 in postseason play. But it appears as though the SEC is taking dominance again in the sport. Would love to hear from you here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. See you next time.